very fortunate to introduce this great panel of development experts to share their perspectives to help us navigate the session. And the phrase comes to mind, saving the best till last. I will introduce the panel a bit, but I found it very challenging to summarize the richness of your experience, so please excuse my brevity. So moderating the panel and sitting in the middle is Wairu Kinyori Gugu. So she's currently works as an independent consultant and has held previous roles as Director of Programs for Oxfam Kenya and the Kenya Development Foundation. She's got an expertise in public policy, gender equality, whoop whoop, and tax justice, just to name a few. And also Wairu will be documenting this session for her blog. And we've also got Ezra Mungori, who's the Executive Director of the Akiba Uhaki Foundation, which is a human rights and social justice fund in East Africa. He's previously sat on the board of Oxfam South Africa and has held a leadership and advisory roles in a huge range of organizations looking at reducing urban poverty. Ezra also has fellowships from Harvard Kennedy and Kellogg School of Management, I believe. And lastly, we have GK Nukunda, who is an economist and public policy specialist. He specializes in public sector reforms, strengthening governance and institutions for over 19 years, including implementing legislative change.
So welcome to this session. We're really excited. We were told that we have the graveyard shift, but we are happy all the same because this is an exciting topic for all of us, and we've been in the sector for a couple of years, some more than others. But we're really privileged to be here, and Karibuni Nairobi and Karibuni Kenya. So Ezra, why did you decide to join the sector?
You know, one of those things you say, I don't think I had much choice, you know. I went through university and was basically headed to becoming, actually my mom's dream was that I would be a teacher. And if there's anything I hated, it's the thought of being a teacher. So I go through university, I get posted to a school, and then I hear about this internship that I should apply for. And it was one of those things that happens. I become an intern with an international organization. And in my first 3 months in the internship, it was a 9-month internship, but in the first 3 weeks of that internship, I traveled almost the whole world. You can imagine the culture shock and, you know, just the totally different perspectives I got there. But what was important for me is that during that time, that 3 weeks, what these guys were exposing me was to all the situations of poverty all over the world. I mean, I went, you know, I saw the Great Wall of China, I went to Hong Kong, I went to the Philippines, I went to the US. I ended up in you know, a red line district in Chicago, for instance. So basically it was exposure to human poverty at terrible levels. And so the moment I got back into Kenya, I thought to myself, hey, we've got to do something about this country. I can't afford to be, you know, I cannot believe that there is nothing I can do about these situations, and I don't want to be exposed to this sort of poverty and to know how much it exists in Kenya. And then the moment I came back, I ended up in Mathare, in the slums. And I thought to myself, there's something wrong, you know? And I was wondering if it's something that had been planned for me or what my role in it was. That's why I joined this sector. So from then on, I worked in the NGO sector.
When I was in high school, I did well. And and I overheard a conversation. My mom was a teacher, the uncle was a doctor. So I overheard a conversation, you know, now he's okay. You know, you're a teenager, he's stable, and his grades, he could make a doctor. I couldn't believe. I'm like, I can't be a doctor. So I successfully dropped my grades. I'm very serious. So, because the way it was when you went to high school, if you got an A, you know, you would automatically sort of get those sort of kind of degrees, and it would be hard to change. So it was very clear I was intentional to study economics. And I just got my good grade for economics. And then when I went to that interlude before uni, which is very interesting, I used to watch League of Boston. It's a legal drama. And I'm like, I want to do law, but I still want to do economics. Anyway, so go to uni, started at my degree in economics, did a year. Then after a year, I said, and I went back and changed to do law, which you do know. And I did for a semester. Then I'm like, let me go back to economics. And so, when I went back to economics, I then did, we call it a major degree. It's like you have 2 degrees, but it's one. Then took another degree. It was called, GPA, Government and Public Administration. So when I finished, I was very clear. I wanted to be in this space where law and economics interact. And then when I finished, just actually during my 3rd year break, I went to Rotterdam for a short course for a few months. I went for 3 months, and even had to get some special permission from school because I would miss a few exams. So I think for me that was it for me. So I'm in the international development space, but pretty much the policy institutional space, and pretty much also what motivates me is what then needs to be done. I mean, Ezra has a bigger heart than mine, but what needs to be done to improve services. Reason being for those who come from developing countries, the poor totally depend on public services. Totally. I mean, if it's not working, it means many livelihoods will be destroyed and that kind of a thing. So that's how I found myself here, and it's been a good ride, Yeah, and a bit rough, but it's been 19 years. There's some things that we've been part of, we've contributed. Things change a little bit, but we keep on trying to do what we can do.
I didn't know that you gave up on law so fast. So, I mean, I'll talk about my journey because it's interesting, because for me it was a choice to be in the sector, in the development sector, because, I mean, when I was young, I always wanted to be a social worker. Like, I remember thinking I want to go to Mathare in my sneakers, which I still wear, and just be there and help people and, be with them and connect with them. And I did a lot of it in campus, and I'd take people for all these experiences in the informal settlements. And people would, I'd be surprised because it came so naturally to me, but people would be so uncomfortable with that experience. And, they'd be like, almost feel like they don't want to be there, right? And this is, urban Nairobi, because I grew up in Nairobi. But the challenge was my parents were, the old school parents, where you have to do the serious degrees, the laws, the engineering, those kind of things. If you have, so I ended up in law. And when I went through my career journey, and at some point after my master's, I made a choice. I said, you know what, I want to work in the development sector because I want to be part of change. And this came really a lot. It was a push came from when we had the post-election violence in 2007, and I just couldn't believe at how helpless that I felt when things were just happening. And I'm those people who, I love Kenya, and many of you have traveled Kenya, and maybe you'll know why I love Kenya. I love Kenya. I love being here. I love Africa. I love everything about Africa. And I was just like, I just need to be part of that change. I remember when, doing my master's abroad, and everyone is like, no, stay here, there's opportunities. And it was just after, we had a new constitution, and I was like, no, I have to go back. I have to go back home because I have to be part of that change. And yeah, so I chose to be in the development sector, and I love it. And it breaks my heart many times, but so many times it also just uplifts me. And yeah, I'm living my passion really, and I'm just only too happy to share part of that passion with all of you. So basically, I don't know how many of you have interacted with international aid and international development aid. This is a topic that's of passion to the 3 of us, and we've talked about it. I've talked with GK about it. I've talked to Ezra about it. I've talked to Tim about it many, many times. And so we wanted to have a conversation with, I wanted to bring my friends to have a conversation, but for you to also listen in and share your inputs and your insights at the end. So I came up with a few statistics around how international development aid looks like in Kenya, which was very interesting for me. So Kenya received 3.9 billion of official development assistance in 2020, so 2019, 2020. And this is from bilateral donors. So you have your UK government, your US government, etc. You have your multilaterals, you have your, UNICEF, your WFP, etc. And you have your IFIs, your international financial institutions. So your World Bank, your IMF, and your AFDB, your Africa Development Bank. So 3.9 billion. And this is just, well, I don't know how many of you know this, but it's 10%, around 10% of the national budget. And most of it actually goes into government. A lot of the international aid in Kenya goes into government and to support ministries. For the not-for-profit sector, us, all of the ones who are seated here, the NGOs, we received $1.9 billion, right? And spent 1.6 billion, which is around 5% of the national budget. But contrary to what our assumptions are, 60% of it actually went to spent on projects. This is just broadly. 27% on emoluments, 10% on administration, and another 3% on running costs. So interestingly enough, that the resources that went to the NGOs and the resources that went to the government, most of it went to healthcare, and this is especially because of COVID. So there's a big hike in international aid 2019, 2020 because of COVID, so went to health. Interestingly, the IFIs, so the World Bank, IMF, etc., are funding a lot of governance and security, education, agriculture, and food security. So that's a lot of where the money that comes to Kenya goes to in international aid. So I just thought I'd just put the stats out there and just quickly ask you guys what you think about it. Like, is it surprising to you? Is it like, okay, yeah, that was quite obvious? What do you think about it, GK?
Yeah, thank you, Wairu. I'm just trying to see what to make sense out of this. So obviously, for what do you call it, the 3.9 billion, this is US dollars, being 10%. That also says something about Kenya as a country in terms of how much, what do you call it, international aid or international development is part of government expenditure. So, 10%. It's not that much. But then also it also brings in something about, what do you call it, the whole thing of deficit financing, because obviously some are loans, some are grants. Though we are moving away from that. The important thing to note from this statistic, other than the global figure, is where it was spent, and not necessarily the 60% going to projects. It's the sector. So when you think of education, relief, disaster management, so you start to see something, one, about just where the world is. When you think of expenditure that donors are putting in resilience, call it the resilience economy. Things are obviously getting bad. So whatever is categorized as relief disaster, you need to see also that is related to the resilience economy in a big way.
One can also not help thinking about such realities as living in the times of structural adjustment programs, for instance, which were moments of real shifts. But what his narration brought back to mind for me was, in very specific terms, for instance, the dependence of the government on aid, and what that meant. That there are certain things that the government learned to live with and to accept, conditionalities, for instance, and then as a signal of these changes having happened, these shifts having taken place during, and this is a particular example from the time of Kibaki, when some of us in the NGO sector, for instance, had learned to depend on the leverage that donors have on government in order to insist on certain things happening, certain changes taking place. And I recall for instance, I was part of a collective of NGOs that were seeking particular policy changes in how the non-governmental sector was structured in this country. And I remember going to demand from the Attorney General and several other places. I mean, it was an interesting story, but demanding certain policy shifts, and government saying to us that we can forget any changes happening, because they said in fact donors are becoming much more intransigent, and we are not going to deal with them anymore. Now, what happened around that time was this was during Moi's time, and somebody will have to explain what Moi's time was and Kibaki's time and all that. But what we were told then is that because donors had become so stubborn, we could not expect those policy changes to happen. What we ended up doing is using our leverage on donors to cause donors to themselves suggest these changes. And so donors were known, for instance, at the Paris Club meeting, were known to come and present to the government the concerns of NGOs that this policy that governs how they are administered needs to change. And government then would come back to us in Nairobi. This was all happening in Paris. But then government came back to us and said, we can see you guys have been talking to your masters and telling them that we need to change this. Come, let's talk about what needs to change, And so we managed to make some of those changes. Now, fast forward to 10, 15 years after that, and Kibaki is in power, and we in the NGO sector try to use the same trick to get donors to get Kibaki to change certain things. And Kibaki goes at a public event and says, by the way, our economy is in much better shape. Kenyans need to know that they do not need to go to international donors to ask for any changes or even to demand any accountability. They need to be, donors will not make any difference to us. In fact, if Kenyans want the accountability, they're the ones who should be asking us directly for that accountability, because it is their money we are using. It's no longer donor money. So don't anybody come and tell me that because they're a donor, they expect me to account to them any longer. That, for me, was another major shift, and it was an indication that the Kenyan economy was doing pretty well. Thank you very much. And donors really only are here to sort of humor us every so often, and we only spend a little of their resources. So those kinds of shifts, I think, have happened over time, and have been real weather vanes for what the state of the economy is, and whether donors whether international aid will make a difference or not. Yeah.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, sure.
That just to supplement that shift. So here is the thing about the bigger question is, how does change happen, and how then? So what are the approaches? What are the right things to do? So, and I'm imagining some of you in the room who work with FCDO, World Bank and that kind of thing. So as Ezra is explaining, so the relationship of the NGO and the donors and the things they caused to happen, so that brought structural changes to the economy. So that's why then President Kibaki, is actually sort of, saying where we are, and those conditionalities and all those things, they don't make sense. And the point here is, so the whole thing of, in a country, the political economy, it's the two sides of the same coin. So you got to view them, because in terms of international aid and how even programs are designed, they're very, they're very sort of like there's almost, a line, these are economic programs, these are political programs, and then thereafter, the way programs are designed at the sector level, you go to sort of see these two sides of my coin, and then sort of see then, depending on where the country is, sort of the political development and economic development, what then would be the right mix of many things, obviously, that can actually then bring structural change. Because I think that's the thing, and I guess later we'll probably get into economic transformation and where Kenya is and what then it would look like in the future.
Then there was a huge other shift with the entry of China. Yeah. So, so we started having the conversations of, the West wants accountability. They are not accountable. So let's go East. At least we know what to get from the East. At least we know what they want, right? And they're straightforward. And well, a couple of years down the line, we find ourselves in some pretty interesting dilemmas with, huge loans, etc. But one of the things that I wanted to just explore is what have been some of the really good experiences you've had with aid, being in the sector? Some of the really memorable experiences that have, left you, realizing that, there has been some impact of aid in the sector.
Of course, these are conversations of perspective. However, when you think about what Wairo has talked about, the international aid and then enters China. So the year is 2008, and I'm having a conversation with the Minister of State from England. He'd come and he just wanted to get a perspective of how things are. And I remember, obviously, the persons who had invited me, they must have thought I'm crazy, because I'm like, how do you talk to a minister like this? And I remember telling him, let's be honest. So I remember giving him data about, on trade, how much Kenya is exporting to England, and the reverse. And the conclusion of that was, brother, don't compete with China, matters trade. There's some things when you think of the West, especially stuff to do with, accountability, transparency, they've lived this for a long time. There's some things in that regard that work, So when you think about, and, Ezra has said it and has better history, the whole space of bringing about the constitutional change and, the civil liberties, there was a lot of money that actually came from the West, It was there, and obviously then the President Moi wasn't happy with these things. Many had to sacrifice their lives. And then you had, an ambassador, the American ambassador, Hemstone. He was he was so dramatic. He would be on the streets with us. How do you like that? So when you think about some of the support programs that are very targeted for whether it is strengthening or improving democratic governance, you have Kenya is a success story, but as I said, obviously you have perspectives of, how did it go and all that. So because we cannot, exhaust the question of methodology, but I think for me, that space of overhauling or just trying to sort out, civil liberties, the constitutional dispensation, I think that for me, I would cite it as a good example of where international aid, came through, if that is the word that I would use. Yeah.
I remember from a very young age, my parents, for instance, shifted from a rural setting to Nairobi in the year before independence, 1964. And 1963. So we watched independence happen here as a little kid. And the one thing I never forget was a couple of years after that, the introduction of the cooperative movement into the country, into our communities. And my parents being members of what was called the Jamhuri Credit Consumers Cooperative. And I know for a fact, because I found out later, that my dad was not earning very much. He'd moved into Nairobi with 6 kids, with a wife and 6 kids, and a fairly small house. But we basically survived on what salary he had and the cooperative, largesse, because they were members of this cooperative. I see the cooperative movement as a major success story in the same way as GK has cited, because I think that there is a lot that the cooperative movement brought into this country, and a lot of that was underwritten by foreign aid, by aid, from different countries. Largely, the Scandinavian countries, I think, were, the main propagators of the cooperative movement, and I see that as one of the major successes that they can claim, even though corruption and all that came engaged after that. But I think I see that as a really, really instructive story, how the cooperative movement changed this country's, political economy dramatically. Yeah.
So I think for me, the best experience is of international aid that I have seen is in monies that were put into developing local civil society organizations to be financially stable, to be financially sustainable. And this is from an organization that I worked for that actually, for a long time, there's been this conversation about, not-for-profits, what happens when the donor money leaves, right? And for the first time I experienced an organization that actually thought about it and did something about it. And a lot of the support came from aid, but mostly from the philanthropy organizations. And I've just seen the important role that philanthropy has played in this country, and is playing in the civil society sector, and is playing in just changing the narratives. I was actually reading something about Mackenzie Scott, the former, the ex of Jeff Bezos, and how she's just giving out millions of dollars to organizations and just shifting the whole ecosystem, really. And this organization I worked with brought together, always started from the premise that communities have something to give, that they're not completely poor, right? That they have something. And I remember the first experience was that, we would give matching grants. So we would say, okay, we would go to the community and we would tell them, okay, what do you want to do? And they would say, okay, we want to build a hospital, we want to build a school, we want to build a boarding. So we went to a community which is about 200 kilometers from Nairobi, and they said, you know what, we want more classrooms, and we want a boarding kind of facility for the girls, because we feel that they're not able to get the education that they need. And then, okay, we were like, okay, that's fine. What can you contribute towards that? And the whole community brought goats, and they brought like lots and lots of goats, and they were put in this pen. And they said, this is what we're contributing. And the value of those goats was actually 60% of how much they needed to build those facilities. And, it completely blew me away, because it reinforced the fact that communities have something to give, and that many times we're just saying they're so poor and they need us, but they have something that they can contribute. And that was such a powerful thing for me. And this then grew out into building out matching grants and building out endowment funds to support community initiatives like that. So where we would bring money together and would invest it, and then the interest that came out of it would then go back to supporting models like that have just shaped how I've thought about development, moving forward, and realizing that there's a place where we can start from. I mean, I want to also talk about the role that international aid has played in just the women's rights movement in Kenya and in Africa, because a lot of money has gone into, and even when you look at the education programs, you will find that many of them have gone into educating girls. And what we call the girl child, and many young women and many women in the sector have actually come to the space and have been able to be economically independent, etc., because of international aid. Now that we've painted such a pretty picture of international aid, I'm sure you're like, okay, why didn't I join this sector? Maybe, Ezra, you can tell us what has been your worst experience.
Aid that is not responsive to what the needs are, and the needs have been described by those who are in need, is really bad aid. I'll give you a very concrete example. This is something, a personal experience, and it came from a country that I will not name, because you guys might guess it very easily. But what the situation was that where people in that country were saying they would really like to help poor Africans, and they asked if they could send a group to come and I was working with Catholic Relief Services then, and so we were considered fairly neutral, and so these people say we'd like to be shown a development situation where we can make a difference, and we're going to send out a team that will come and look at that situation, and we'd like to know then how we might help. And we said, fine, you're welcome to send your team here. And they came out, and now they said, give us an idea of the situation, of the place you will take us to, and give us an idea of what the needs are, and then let the team come and determine it. And so we described, basically from our strategic plan, a project that we had in mind, and we said this is an area that could use some help. And it was soon after a declaration of a famine in the north of Kenya, which is very similar to the drought we have right now. And so we were thinking, well, sinking some boreholes would be really good to provide water in that place, and providing other forms of support that will enable this community to become more resilient and to at least be able to feed itself would be a way to go. So this team comes from that country, and they say they'd like us to take them to the projects where the wells might be dug. I had a brilliant boss who knew people from that country quite well, and I had problems with taking this team because I told him, they wanted to see every possible location for drilling boreholes. And what my boss told me is, he says, I know these people. In fact, I was married to one of them before. So, let me tell you how we're going to organize that. So he made me put together a travel program in the north of Kenya, which basically involved starting from the first location for borehole digging, and then going to the furthest one we could find, and then coming back to the one that's closest to that one, but a real distance from that. He said the idea is we're going to tie these guys out in the first 2 days so bad that they will tell us, yeah, we've seen all we need to see. I didn't realize that was actually the smartest way to deal with it, because indeed, during the second day, I was heading up this group that was doing all these tours, and the guy, the leader of that team, came back to me and he said, I think we've gotten a pretty good idea of what the needs are. And these distances are really huge to cover, and so we understand that. So why don't we plan to go back to Nairobi, and then we can see what other form of help we might give. The only problem with that is they had also asked us what kind of pumps we will use, and what other means we would need and all. So we go back to Nairobi and we take them to the company that's producing the pumps for us, and they want to take a picture of everything that's being done. And of course, being from an engineering company, the head of the engineering company didn't take, he took exception to people taking pictures, because he said, how do we know these guys are not going to go and replicate them there and mess our market? Long story short, when these guys went back after their tour, they had picked up a totally different story. They said, yes, those people do need water, okay? But also, we noticed all the people we went to visit, none of them were wearing shoes. And so they went and put together a container full of tennis shoes. And these were all, because these are, it's Africans, and they're big, they gave us a range in sizes from 7.5 to 13, size 13 tennis shoes. We get this container, and then they said mosquitoes are a real big problem as well. So we got a bunch of drugs. None of them deal with mosquitoes because they don't know mosquitoes out there. But we had all the medicaments you might require for a bunch of Africans who are in real need of medicine, because they went to the clinic and noticed that there were no drugs there. So they were going to send those drugs from their country. I'm glad I didn't say which country this was because it was crazy. But we get these shipments, and then we discover that the machine they were talking about doing the pumping were totally different from what we were intending to buy. So in the end, anyway, they sent out money, which was a fraction of what we needed to do that project. In the end, the project didn't work. But also we had problems with distributing these shoes, as you can imagine. I mean, I wear a size 11, but, and that was one of the smaller ones in the thing. So, we had problems there. But for me, this was one of the worst projects we ever, were involved with. And the problem is, we had people in our group who were insisting that we send the whole container back. But then we also had people who were saying, no, we can make use of this, we can do. And so we ended up in a debate like we had with food aid, where the argument is, if you're going to take American food aid, then find ways of monetizing it, and then you can use the money for some good, But the question is, where are you going to sell size 13 shoes, tennis shoes? What country will take that? So you can understand.
For me to give an example of the worst, just to help us with the perspective. So you got aid, international aid that is very focused on, that is concessional loans, those type of things. And you got, this aid that is the service provision, water, drilling boreholes like Ezra was, or, education program and TFGM and all that. And I'm bringing that so that we sort of then get to see. So for me, my worst example was, I was raised by parents who were civil servants. My dad was a business. I think he had a mind of business. So he had a shop, and he was farming. So the produce, the potatoes, the milk from the cows, the beans, and the maize, he would supply to the local high school, because they're boarding schools. And life was good. And I vividly remember it's not my dad, our lives changed after the introduction of SAPs, the structural adjustment programs, completely. So the schools don't have money either to buy or to pay. So and obviously the enterprise for farming completely went down. So I'm in a family where my older siblings had it all. They had a good life, So for me, that's actually it's my worst example of what international aid can do. And why I was bringing that bit for the concessional loans or the aid that is very service, provision and all that, is to sort of see where things go wrong. So the side for service provision, whether it is the boreholes and all those things, where it goes wrong is the perspective of sustainability in terms of not responding to the needs of the community. And the second bit is it's not embedded within the community structure. It just, you have a borehole. It's come from Italy. The year is 2022. The part that is broken, the last time it was manufactured was in 1978. You're not gonna get it. Those sort of, type of things, or whether it is IFAD, they would do the furrows, and things have changed from decreased water sources, and just things sort of go haywire. So I think that is good, because I think in as much as we're in this conversation and sort of the things we talked about that worked, it's good to sort of see that and then apply an analytical mind so that see what goes wrong. But for me, SAP, it was a while. It's personal.
While you have the mic,
Yes.
please tell us how can aid then how can it change so that it responds to the needs of Kenyan people?
So let me try to be a bit comprehensive. So when you think about the structure of the economy, so you have agriculture is still in Kenya, it's still big. You got 80% who still depend on agriculture, but you got other, whether it is the service industry, the manufacturing, they are growing, but it's a bit slow. So when you think about that, the same thing I said about you can't separate the political economy and economic development. So you have to sort of enter into that space from that worldview. So what is the structure of the economy? So in terms of then international aid, what should be the approach? So when you think of that, then you'll be thinking about, so what's the trajectory of growth of this particular country? So for Kenya, what's the trajectory of growth? And you got to bring in the perspective of economic transformation, because whether it is the donors, whether it's the private sector or the government, these need to work together. Even the community and ourselves, these all actors need to work together for the realization of the economic transformation. So think of how then the donors get into the space of how do they work to bring about private sector development. What needs to be done in that perspective? Is it, programs on business and environment reform, all those things, property rights? Remember, you may want to view it from democratic governance perspective, but there are probably things we've done about accountability, but you need to flip that and see how do you work in governance, but you're sorting out things to do with business environment reforms, all those things. So think about the thing of you got to think about the dynamic of the demography in Kenya. So what do you do as donor, negotiating and obviously designing with the country, that you have the bulk of the youth who don't have jobs, yet you have a spirit of entrepreneurship, what there needs to be done. You got to think about, the ICT revolution. So what needs to be done in that space so that, as I'm saying, you're comprehensively, or rather you're looking at the economy, from a comprehensive perspective. So I think in terms of the biggies, in terms of just in this space, obviously there's an issue of, design, but a design for me that is very, you need to integrate sectors. Those things of, you're doing an agric, program. Agriculture is important to us, but you got a whole value chain. You got agriculture, you got logistics, you got, export. At the same time, you got to think about, the business, environment, and then that in itself, you have to have a perspective. How do you attract investment? So when you think of, Kenya, we have the devolved system of government. It's a big deal, or rather, it's a big driver of the economy. You got the likes of us, probably, who could only get jobs in Nairobi, but now you're going into the other, into the subnational level. So you got also to also start thinking, even in this space, international aid, where does it go to, so that it makes sense? Obviously, for purposes of political development, but also for purposes of economic development. So I think for me, the view needs to change, be that comprehensive, and then, in terms of then design, issues of sustainability, issues of the big things that are happening, from ICT to the youth bulge to innovation. I mean, sometimes I think we limit innovation to the IT perspective. There is also innovation within technology that is outside information technology. So I can stop there.
GK has covered it really well. All I'd say is that we also need to recognize that there's a definite need for a major mind shift, in all that's happening. I mean, we are in times of climate change. These are realities that are confronting us now, and maybe in the process of trying to achieve that mind shift change, we should be thinking about, what we're going to do about like the condescending attitude that the aid givers has had all this time, and how do we make sure that happens to the extent where we realize that we're all in this together. If we want it or not, we're all going to perish. So where do we go from now? No, on this question of good models, I want to say, first of all, if I ever got any pleasure from watching debates in the development field, in the development sector, it was especially watching debates between donors, USAID and, British Aid and all of these, fighting over what they were, what their piece of the pie was going to be, and what they want to be the exclusive ones that do this and all. And in the course of my interacting with different development actors, I developed a lot of respect, for instance, and I'll say this, without any thing, I developed a massive amount of respect for the Swedes, because the Swedes will not prescribe anything. They will say, look, You put your plans together. You tell us what your needs are. We will tell you if we can give that. And then you decide how you're going to implement it. And you tell us over time whether you've achieved the results that you were hoping to achieve. And I don't think anything can beat that if it's done properly, you know? So, and I say the Swedes because most of the projects that I have gotten to know and interrogate have had origins in that respect. Now, it even got to a point where in some situations when I applied for funding from some countries or from some organizations, one of the questions that I'd have to answer, and this I'll say in fact was one Swedish organization, I had to answer the question, who else funds your activities? When they discovered that some organizations from other countries fund the organization, they said, we cannot give you this support because you're taking money from those other countries, and we do not believe their policies are healthy for this sort of interaction, you know? And so that taught us, I mean, it taught us to sort of go back and question what their, their theories for development are, and how that either concurred or went against what we thought, you know? So that's as close as I can come to giving concrete examples.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so should we continue with aid or not?
I think aid makes a big difference in some situations where you're dealing with vulnerabilities, with major vulnerabilities. And I think that if it is understood, this is why I talked about the importance of a mind shift. Because if it is administered well, if it is thought through carefully, it can make a huge difference. And I think that there is a strong case for aid.
The pros, the cons, and the cons, and all these things. Some countries default, and so what are the alternatives? Sustainability. And when you spoke, he reminded me of when I landed in London, East London. He spoke, and I'm like, these people don't speak English, but yeah. So, for the pros and cons, I think we must appreciate and understand this system is here for a long time. It's got part of it is business. Anytime I get an opportunity to work with the World Bank program, I tell fellow Kenyans, this is part of our money. It's not World Bank money. So that whole thing of, countries, make subscriptions, and then that money then goes to Ghana or goes to, that won't change. But I think for me, is two things. One is countries where, things physically are really, really bad, they don't have much choice. They will have to take, the IMF facilities, your situation in England as we speak. But for poorer countries, it's bad. And, they introduce some concessions that they destroy the fundamentals of the economy. So I think, so what are the alternatives? Some of the alternatives tend to be expensive. So for example, if you go to the commercial market, you got loans that are very quick to procure, but they have zero accountability, so the citizens don't benefit. So it's a catch-22. So, but I think for sustainability, for programs where the design includes the needs of the people or the real needs, you increase chances of sustainability. In terms of overrepresentation and ensuring that the beneficiaries are part of whether it's a decision or they get to know how money is being spent, I guess, my sister, it's a big conversation about the models, the big multilateral use, the contractor thing, when you think of, if you did an analysis of the portfolio probably of Tetra Tech being one of the USAID contractors, it will shock you the amount of money they have. He's sort of like agreeing with me. But there is no way that system will allow some woman in Turkana, who is a beneficiary, to be there. I think the shift then needs to be from the other side. The community is coming together, they've got assets, and they have a perspective of some empowerment of, if you're designing a program, which is to benefit us, we need to do it together. So, and I think the whole thing of whether it is those cooperative movements we're talking about is because we own this thing. The money is ours. We decide on the interest rate and that kind of a thing. It's a similar model. Can it work? Yes, it can, but it will need to begin with a lot of empowerment from people to have an understanding. These are our needs. This is the methodology that will work, and we will be in charge. But it's slow. but it can work. These things tend to take time. So thank you very much.
One, because the resources are shrinking, and the secondly is that the mindsets of the people giving now are different. So millennials and Gen Z will not be okay with, and will not be okay with people taking money and spending it on having a good time in the name of aid. And so you'll find more and more do not want their tax money to go into, and I mean, it's happening in the UK, I think, right? They're saying, there's problems in the UK, so why should we be giving money to the global south when we have serious issues here? And some will be saying, you know what, I don't want my tax money to go into these programs, I want my tax money to go into these. So there'll be serious pushback, and especially because of the pressures on incomes, and so it's going to change because, and accountability is going to come because people will start pushing for that accountability. The other thing that I was thinking is that even in the global south, people are changing. So that person in Turkana, you'll be imagining that poor woman with beads, etc. But now, with a millennial Gen Z person in Turkana is someone who has a mobile phone, who is on the internet, who's on Facebook, and is connecting with people. So your idea of who the poor person is, or the idea of who the poor person is changing. And when you take money there, they'll be like, you know what, we can take your money or we cannot, or you give us the money and we'll spend it on whatever it is. Then you'll be running around doing accountability and what have you, but people have spent their money on airtime and bundles and what have you, and building their businesses, right? So I think the issue of huge donor funds, that's going to change. And in a context like Kenya, it's already changing. There's a lot of pushback, and people are saying what they want. And I'll give an example where, an expert from a country came and they were wanting to give us expertise. And we pushed back and we said, we don't need your expertise because we have expertise, and it was not taken very well. And where we felt empowered enough to ask the global north, if you want accountability from us, and if we want accountability from our beneficiaries, then you also need to be accountable. And there's so many times I made them open up their budgets. For a long time, we never knew how much money was coming in. And the only reason I got to know is because I said, open up your budget. I want to see the global budget. And just as you scrutinize our budget, we will scrutinize your budget. And that changed, it changed the game. It changed the game because we used to have a power analysis paradigm where it's like, we got the power too. We got the power to ask the questions, and they couldn't push back. The most we could be told is that, we should be grateful that we are even getting the money. But I was like, you know what? You can't do without us. You can't do without us, because if you're taking international aid and you're bringing it here, who are you taking it to? What will you tell your donor? Who will you tell your taxpayers the money is going to? So we all need to be accountable, and we also need to hold others accountable, because we are the ones who are going to be in that system, right? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Ezra. Thank you so much, GK. And thank you all.